When we talk about morality, we are really talking about the ideas that tell us what is right and what is wrong. Think of it as the set of rules we all use to decide how to act with other people. Those rules can feel as natural as breathing, but they are also things we learn from the people around us. Imagine you are sharing a snack with a friend. You have a choice. You can give a piece away, or you can keep it all for yourself. The feeling you get when you give a piece away, a warm sense of doing something good, is a small taste of what morality feels like. Now picture a secret that a friend has asked you to keep. You can hold on to it, or you can tell someone else. The decision you make will be judged by the same kind of moral sense. If you keep the secret, you are being trustworthy. If you break it, you are being disloyal. These tiny moments add up to the bigger picture of what we call morality. Why do we call something moral or immoral? One simple argument comes from the idea of harm. If an action makes other people feel hurt, lose something, or become worse off, we tend to label it immoral. If it helps, protects, or makes life better for others, we call it moral. This is a kind of do no harm rule. It is easy to see it in everyday life. When you give a snack, you are not hurting anyone, you are helping. When you keep a secret that could protect a friend from danger, you are also helping. A second argument is based on fairness. If an action treats people the same way, or gives each person what they deserve, we see it as moral. If it gives special treatment to some and leaves others behind, we see it as immoral. This fairness idea is behind many rules we learn as kids. For example, taking turns on a swing is fair. Cutting in line is not. The fairness rule tells us why we feel good when we wait our turn, and why we feel uneasy when someone skips ahead. Let's look at a kid who finds a lost toy on the playground. The toy belongs to another child. The kid can keep it, hide it, or try to find the owner. If the kid decides to look for the owner and returns the toy, most people will say that was a moral act. The reason is simple. The kid did not cause harm, and the kid helped restore something that was missing. The kid also followed the fairness rule. The toy went back to the child who originally owned it, not to the finder. Now think about a friend who hears a secret that could protect another person from a bully. The friend can tell the bully what the secret is, or keep it quiet. If the friend tells the bully might use the secret to hurt the other person. If the friend stays silent, the other person stays safe. Most people would call staying silent a moral choice because it prevents harm. This shows how that do no harm argument works in a real situation. But life is not always that clear. Imagine the same friend hears that the bully is planning to hurt someone else, and the only way to stop the bully is to tell a teacher the secret. The secret could also cause the bully to get punished. Some might say that telling the teacher is the right thing, because it could save a life. This is a counter-argument to the simple keep the secret rule. It shows that sometimes breaking a promise can be moral if it prevents a bigger harm. Another counter-argument comes from the sharing example. Suppose you have a small bag of cookies and a friend asks for one. You think about sharing, but you also remember that you need those cookies for a test later. If you share, you might feel good, but you could end up feeling weak and perform poorly. Some might say that sharing in this case is not moral because it hurts the giver. The idea here is that moral rules are not always absolute. They can clash with each other. We have to weigh the outcomes. These little stories help us see how moral thinking works in everyday life. They also show that people have been thinking about these questions for a very long time. One early historical note comes from tribal societies that lived thousands of years ago. Those groups lived close together, and they needed rules to keep the group safe. Many of those rules were about sharing food, protecting the weak, and punishing those who stole. The rules were passed down by story and by example. A hunter who shared his catch with the group earned respect, while a thief who stole from the group was shunned. Those early rules are a kind of first step toward what we now call morality. A second historical note comes from ancient Greece, where philosophers talked about justice. The Greek word dikaiosine meant more than just law. It meant doing what is right for the community. One famous thinker, Plato, wrote that a just person is someone who does what is good for the whole city, not just for themselves. Later, Aristotle said that justice is giving each person what they deserve. Both ideas tie back to the fairness argument we mentioned earlier. They show that even in ancient times, people saw a link between moral action and the idea of treating people fairly. You can also hear the voice of an ancient Chinese teacher on this topic. Confucius said, "Do not do to others what would hurt you." That short line captures the harm-based rule in a very clear way. It tells us to think about how our actions affect other people and to avoid causing pain. The Roman philosopher Cicero wrote, "The moral law is the same in all places and at all times." He meant that there is a common sense of right and wrong that people share, no matter where they live. This idea supports the thought that morality is not just a personal preference, but something we all can agree on when we look at the outcomes of our actions. When we try to decide whether an action is moral, we often ask ourselves a few simple questions. Does this action hurt anyone? Does it treat people fairly? Does it help the community? These questions are not fancy. They are the same kind of questions a child might ask when deciding whether to share a snack. Let's bring the examples back to see how the questions work. In the lost toy story, the child asks, "Will keeping the toy hurt the owner?" "Yes, it will." "Will returning it help?" "Yes, it will." "Is it fair to give the toy back?" "Yes, it is." So the child's answer points to a moral choice. In the secret-keeping story, the friend asks, "Will telling the secret hurt the person I want to protect?" "Yes, it could." "Will keeping it protect them?" "Yes, it does." "Is it fair to keep a promise?" Usually, yes. So the friend leans towards staying silent. But then the extra twist about a possible danger adds a new question. Will staying silent cause a bigger harm? If the answer is yes, the friend might decide that breaking the promise is the better moral move. These kinds of back and forth thinking is what philosophers call moral reasoning. It is not a magic formula, but a way of looking at the effects of what we do. Some people argue that morality comes from feeling. They say we have a built-in sense that tells us when something feels right or wrong. This feeling is often called conscience. When you feel a knot in your stomach after you think about stealing a candy bar, that knot is your conscience warning you that the act may be immoral. Others argue that morality comes from rules that societies create. They point out that different cultures have different rules about what is right. For example, in some places it is moral to give a gift to a neighbor on a holiday, while in other places it might be seen as a bribe. This rule-based view says that we learn morality from the people around us, not just from our own feelings. Both of these ideas, feeling and rule, show up in the everyday examples we talked about. When the kid feels good about returning the toy, that is the feeling side. When the kid follows the rule, return what is not yours, that is the rule side. Modern thinkers still talk about these old ideas. A philosopher named Peter Singer talks about the greatest good for the most people. He says that when we decide what is moral, we should think about how many people will benefit or suffer. This is a version of the harm argument, but it adds a bit of math to the mix. Another modern voice, the psychologist Jonathan Haidt, says that our moral judgments start with quick gut reactions, and then we use reasoning to justify them. He calls this the social intuitionist model. In simple terms, you first feel that something is right or wrong, then you find reasons to back it up. This matches the way many of us decide to share a snack or keep a secret. You can see how these modern ideas link back to the ancient ones. The greatest good idea is a modern take on the Greek notion of justice for the whole community. Haidt's gut-feeling idea is a modern way of describing the conscience that Confucius talked about. Let's try a fresh example to see how the ideas work together. Imagine you find a wallet on the street. Inside there is cash and an ID. You can keep the cash and drop the wallet, or you can try to find the owner. The harm argument says that keeping the cash hurts the owner because they lose money. The fairness argument says that the owner deserves to get their wallet back. The feeling argument says you might feel uneasy keeping the money. The rule argument says, don't take what is yours. All of these point toward returning the wallet as the moral choice. Now think about a different case. A student sees a classmate cheat on a test. The student can report the cheating, which might cause the cheater to fail the class, or stay quiet, letting the cheater get a good grade. The harm argument says that reporting could hurt the cheater's future. The fairness argument says that cheating is unfair to everyone else who studied. The feeling argument might make the student feel guilty for staying quiet. The rule argument says cheating is wrong. Balancing these ideas can be tough, and that is why moral decisions often feel complicated. These complications are why philosophers have spent centuries writing about morality. They try to give us tools to sort out the competing reasons. One tool is called the Golden Rule. Treat others as you would like to be treated. This rule is simple enough for a child, yet it captures both harm and fairness ideas. If you imagine yourself in the other person's shoes, you can see whether your action would feel good or bad. Another tool is called the categorical imperative. It sounds fancy, but the basic idea is to ask, if everyone did this, would the world be better? If the answer is no, then the action is likely immoral. For example, if everyone kept secrets that could save lives, we might end up with a world where no one trusts anyone. That shows the limits of the keep secrets rule. Even though we have these tools, everyday life still throws us curveballs. That is why stories like The Lost Toy or The Secret are useful. They let us practice the thinking without the pressure of real consequences. Over time, we get better at spotting the patterns that guide moral choices. Let's bring in another historical anecdote. In the early 1800s, a group of Native American tribes in the Pacific Northwest had a rule that no one could take a piece of another's canoe without permission. The canoe was a vital tool for fishing and travel. If someone stole a piece, the whole family could suffer. The rule was enforced by the community, and breaking it could lead to being ostracized. This rule shows how early societies linked morality to the well-being of the group. It also shows the fairness idea. You cannot take what belongs to another without asking. A second anecdote comes from the ancient city of Athens. During a public trial, a man named Socrates was asked to stop questioning the authorities. He refused, saying that searching for truth was a moral duty. The judges sentenced him to death. Socrates' stand shows a clash between personal conscience and the laws of the city. Some say his choice was moral because he followed his inner sense of right, even though the law said otherwise. Others argue that breaking the law was immoral because it threatened social order. This story highlights how moral judgments can depend on whether we prioritize conscience or rules. Both anecdotes help us see that morality is not a single line on a page. It is a living set of ideas that grow with the people who use them. We can also look at a modern example that many of us have faced, deciding whether to post a photo that might embarrass a friend. The photo could be funny, but it could also hurt the friend's reputation. The harm argument says posting could cause pain. The fairness argument says the friend deserves respect. The feeling argument might make you laugh at the photo, but also feel a little guilty. The rule argument says, don't share something that could harm another. Most people would choose not to post, seeing it as the moral choice. Now think about a situation where sharing could actually hurt the giver. Imagine you have a limited supply of medicine for a family member. A neighbor asks if they can have some because their child is sick. If you give them the medicine, you help the neighbor, but you might not have enough for your own family. The harm argument goes both ways. You could cause harm to your family, or you could help the neighbor. The fairness argument says you should prioritize those who need it most. The feeling argument might make you feel compassion for the neighbor, but also worry for your family. The rule argument might be take care of those closest to you first. In this case, the moral decision is not obvious, and it shows that sometimes moral rules can conflict. These examples show how the simple arguments we started with, harm and fairness, can be enough to start a conversation about right and wrong. They also show why we need to think about each case on its own. When we look at the big picture, morality is a guide that helps us live together. It is not a strict set of laws that never change. It is more like a compass that points us toward actions that keep people safe, happy, and respected. The compass can wobble when the wind changes, but it still gives us a direction. In the end, the question, what is morality, can be answered in a short sentence. It is the practice of choosing actions that do not harm others and that treat people fairly. That sentence pulls together the two main arguments we talked about. It also fits with the stories, the historical notes, and the modern ideas. Remember, you do not need a philosophy degree to use morality. You just need to pause, think about who might be affected, and ask whether the action feels right, fair, and helpful. If you do that, you are already practicing what philosophers have been talking about for centuries. So the next time you are sharing a snack, keeping a secret, or deciding whether to tell a truth that could hurt, try to ask yourself those simple questions. Notice how the feeling in your gut, the idea of fairness, and the possible outcomes all play a part. By paying attention to those parts, you are training your moral compass. And that is how we can understand morality in plain terms, using everyday moments, simple arguments, real stories, and a bit of history. It is not a mystery locked away in a dusty book. It lives in the choices we make each day, from the playground to the office, from the ancient tribe to the modern city. By looking at those choices, we can see the shape of morality and learn to walk its path with a calm and steady heart. When we sit down with a cup of coffee and think about why we call something right or wrong, the first thing we notice is that people have been asking that question for thousands of years. The answers that early cultures gave still echo in the way we talk about morality today. In this part of the story, we will walk through 4 ancient worlds: the Egyptians, the Hebrews, the Greeks, and the Chinese, and see how each of them tried to make sense of good and bad. We will meet a few key voices: the lawgiver who wrote the Ten Commandments, the teacher who taught about proper conduct in the Analects, and the philosopher who imagined a perfect city in the Republic. We will also look at two everyday pictures that help us feel the ideas: a farmer who follows the seasons and a child who learns to wait for a turn. Along the way we will hear two counterpoints: one that treats morality as a set of laws, another that treats it as a habit we grow. And we will hear two short stories that bring the ancient ideas to life: the Egyptian judge who weighed a heart against a feather, and the Greek debate over the just city. By the end, you will see how these early thoughts still shape the way we think about right and wrong. Let us start in the land of the Nile. The ancient Egyptians believed that the world ran on a balance called Ma'at. Ma'at was not just a goddess. She was a principle of order, truth, and fairness. Every day the king would renew his pledge to keep Ma'at, and every person was expected to live in a way that did not upset the balance. The most famous picture of Egyptian moral thinking is the story of the dead being judged. In the Book of the Dead, a man stands before the god Osiris. A feather, the feather of Ma'at, is placed on a scale. The man's heart is placed on the other side. If the heart is lighter than the feather, it means the man lived honestly, without too much selfish desire. If the heart is heavier, it shows he was full of wrongdoing and he is devoured by a monster. The text says, "Your heart will be weighed against the feather of truth." This image tells us that the Egyptians saw moral quality as something that could be measured against a universal standard. It was a cosmic law, not just a human rule. The judge in the story is not a person, but a divine process. Yet, the idea that we are held accountable for the weight of our deeds is a powerful moral image. Now think about a farmer in the same river valley. He watches the flood come each year. He plants his seeds when the soil is moist, and he harvests when the grain is ripe. He does not try to force the river to stay low, nor does he ignore the warning of a coming storm. He follows the natural cycle because he knows that his survival depends on it. The farmer's habit of watching the river and timing his work is a simple way of living in harmony with a larger order. The Egyptian idea of Ma'at works the same way. Keep your actions in line with the natural order of truth and fairness, and you will stay safe. If you try to go against that order, you end up like a seed planted in dry sand. It will not grow. The next ancient voice comes from the Hebrew tradition. The story of the Ten Commandments is told in the book of Exodus. According to the text, Moses climbs a mountain, hears a voice, and receives a set of stone tablets. The first few commands read, "You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God. Remember the Sabbath day, keep it holy. Honor your father and your mother. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness. You shall not covet." These short sentences are meant to be clear rules for how a community should act. The Hebrews saw these rules as a covenant, a binding promise between the people and their God. The idea was that right and wrong were not just personal choices, but part of a contract that kept the whole group safe and blessed. The moral law was written in stone, literally, to remind everyone that the rules did not change with the mood of the moment. If we look at a child learning to wait for a turn, we can see a simple version of this idea. The child watches a parent hand a toy to the first child who asks politely. The child learns that if you wait your turn, you will be treated fairly. If you push ahead, you might be told no and you lose the chance to play. The child's habit of waiting becomes a small internal rule that guides behavior. In the Hebrew story, the 10 Commandments work like a set of rules that the whole community learns to follow. Both the child and the community are taught that there are clear limits that protect everyone. The Hebrews also had a strong sense that moral law came from a higher source. In Deuteronomy, the text says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength." This shows that the moral duties are linked to a relationship with God. The idea that right and wrong are tied to a divine voice is a pattern that shows up later in many other cultures. It also creates a tension that later thinkers will explore. Is morality something we follow because we are told to, or does it come from within us as a habit we develop? Now we move westward to ancient Greece. The Greek world was full of debates about what makes something right. One of the most famous discussions is found in Plato's Republic. In the book, a group of thinkers gathers at the house of the philosopher Socrates. They talk about how a city should be built so that everyone does what they are best at. Plato writes, "Justice is the interest of the stronger." That line actually comes from a character named Thrasymachus, who argues that those in power make the rules that benefit themselves, and that is what we call justice. Socrates pushes back, asking whether a city that only serves the strong can be truly good. The dialogue goes on for many pages, with each character offering a different view of what justice means. The most famous part is the description of the just city, where each class, the rulers, the guardians, and the producers, does its own work and does not meddle in others' jobs. Plato says, "When each does his own work, the city is harmonious." The idea is that right action is tied to the role each person plays in the larger whole. Think of a school classroom where each student has a different job: the line leader, the paper collector, the board eraser. If the line leader tries to also be the board eraser, the class gets confused. If each student sticks to their job, the day runs smoothly. Plato's just city works the same way. The city is a big group, and each person has a part that fits the whole. The Greeks used this story to ask whether morality is about following the right role or about something deeper inside each person. In the same Greek world, another thinker named Aristotle would later argue that moral virtue is a habit we build by practicing good actions. He said that we become brave by doing brave acts, just as we become generous by giving gifts. This view is often called morality as habit. It stands in contrast to the view that morality is a set of fixed laws written on stone. The two ideas, law versus habit, keep showing up throughout history. In the next part of our story, we will see how later cultures pick up these threads. Turning now to ancient China, we meet a teacher named Confucius. He lived in a time of war and chaos, and his main concern was how to bring order back to families and the state. Confucius taught that the heart of a good society is the proper relationship between people. He gave a list of 5 relationships: ruler and subject, father and son, husband and wife, older sibling and younger sibling, and friend and friend. In each pair, there is a duty. The ruler must be caring, the subject must be loyal, the father must be loving, the son must be obedient, and so on. Confucius said, "Do not do to others what you do not want done to you." This is a simple rule that looks a lot like the golden rule in other traditions. He also said, "The man who moves a mountain begins by carrying away small stones." The idea is that moral change starts with small habits not with grand laws. Imagine a gardener planting a row of beans. He does not expect the beans to sprout instantly. He waters them each day, pulls out the weeds, and waits for the rain. Over time, the plants grow tall and strong. The gardener's daily habit of caring for the soil is what makes the harvest possible. Confucius' teaching works the same way. By practicing respect, honesty, and care in everyday moments, a person builds a moral character that can support a larger, stable society. Both the Greek and Chinese traditions also contain stories that illustrate their ideas. In the Greek world, the debate over the just city in Plato's Republic is a story that has been told for more than 2,000 years. The characters argue about whether a ruler should be a philosopher, whether a city should own private property, and whether it is right to punish someone who harms the community. The dialogue ends without a single answer, but it forces the reader to think about what a fair society looks like. In China, there is a famous anecdote about a ruler named Yao who asked his minister, "If I am wrong, will you tell me?" The minister answered, "I will speak the truth, even if it hurts you." This shows that moral duty for Confucius includes speaking truth to power, a habit of honesty that keeps the ruler in check. Now let us bring the two counterpoints into focus. The first counterpoint says that morality is a set of laws, like the 10 Commandments, the Egyptian weighing of the heart, or the rules of the just city. In this view, right and wrong are external standards that we must obey. The advantage of this view is that it gives clear guidance. A child can learn that stealing is wrong, because the rule says, "Do not steal." A society can keep order when everyone knows the law. The downside is that laws can be rigid. They may not fit every situation, and people can follow them for the wrong reasons, out of fear of punishment rather than a sense of goodness. The second counterpoint says that morality is a habit we grow, like the farmer watching the river or the child learning to wait for a turn. In this view, right action comes from practice and from the way we shape our character over time. Aristotle's idea of virtue ethics fits here. The benefit is that habits can adapt to new situations. A person who has built the habit of honesty will likely tell the truth even when no law forces them to. The risk is that habits can be uneven. Some people may never develop good habits if they lack role models or education. Both sides have something to offer. The ancient Egyptians combined the two. They had the law of Ma'at, but they also expected each person to internalize the idea of balance in daily life. The Hebrews wrote laws, yet the prophets later urged people to follow the spirit of the law, not just the letter. The Greeks argued over law versus habit in the Republic, and the Chinese taught that small daily actions build a larger moral order. The conversation continues today. Let us look at a modern example that shows how these ancient ideas still work. In many countries, traffic laws tell us to stop at a red light. That is a law. But many drivers also develop the habit of checking their mirrors before changing lanes, even when there is no sign telling them to do so. The law keeps the road safe, while the habit makes driving smoother. When a driver ignores the law and runs a red light, we call that immoral because it endangers others. When a driver habitually yields to pedestrians, we see that as a good character trait. Another modern case is the way we treat the environment. Some people argue that we need strict laws to limit carbon emissions. That is the law view. Others say that we should develop habits of recycling, using less water, and planting trees, because those habits become part of our daily life. Both approaches echo the ancient debates we have been tracing. Now let us turn to a couple of quotes that bring the ancient voices directly to us. From the Egyptian Book of the Dead we have, "May your heart be light, may you be judged pure, may you be welcomed to the fields of reeds." From the Hebrew Torah we hear, "You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor." From Plato's Republic, Socrates says, "Justice means minding one's own business and not meddling with what is not one's concern." And from Confucius we get, "When you see a good person, try to be like them. When you see a bad person, examine yourself." Each of these short sentences carries a whole worldview about what it means to be right. When we compare these quotes, we see a pattern. The Egyptian line talks about the heart, a symbol of inner feeling. The Hebrew line talks about truth in speech. Plato's line talks about doing your part. Confucius's line talks about learning from others. All four point to a balance between inner quality and outward action. The ancient thinkers were already aware that morality lives both inside us and in the way we treat each other. Let us revisit the farmer analogy for a moment. The farmer does not just follow a law that says, "plant in spring." He watches the sky, feels the soil, and knows from experience when the time is right. He also knows that if he overwatered the field, the crops would rot. His habit of listening to the land is a kind of moral sense that guides his actions. The same can be said of a modern person who looks at a news story about a refugee crisis. They might follow a law that says accept refugees, but they also develop the habit of empathy by reading stories, volunteering, and listening. The habit makes the law feel alive. The child who learns to wait for a turn also shows us how habit and law can work together. The teacher may set a rule to raise your hand before speaking. The child practices that rule, and over time it becomes a habit. The child learns patience, respect, and the idea that other people's voices matter. In a larger sense, societies that teach children to wait for a turn are building citizens who will respect democratic processes, like voting or taking part in a public debate. Now let us think about the two anecdotes again, this time looking at what they teach us about moral thinking. The Egyptian judge who weighed the heart against a feather shows a belief in an objective standard. The feather does not change, and the scale does not favor the rich or the poor. It suggests that the ancient Egyptians believed that moral truth could be measured. At the same time, the story also tells us that each person's heart must be pure. That purity comes from daily choices, from how the person lived. So the story blends law and habit. The Greek debate over the just city in Plato's Republic is a different kind of story. It does not give a single answer, but it forces each participant to examine his own ideas about fairness. The characters argue, and sometimes change their minds. The story shows that moral thinking can be a process, a dialogue, not just a set of rules. It also shows that the idea of justice can be shaped by the way a community is organized, by who holds power, and by the values it teaches. Both stories are still useful today. When a court today weighs evidence to decide guilt, it is doing something similar to the Egyptian scale, trying to match the facts of a case against a standard of law. When a community holds a town hall meeting to discuss a new policy, it is doing something similar to the Greek debate, using dialogue to shape a shared sense of right and wrong. Let us now bring in a few more thinkers who later built on these early ideas. The Roman philosopher Seneca, a Stoic, wrote that we are not harmed by what happens, but by our judgment of it. This echoes the Egyptian idea that the heart's weight matters more than the external event. The early Christian writer Augustine took the Ten Commandments and argued that true morality comes from love inside the heart, not just from following rules. In the East, the Buddhist monk Xuanzang later wrote that moral conduct is a habit of compassion that can be cultivated through meditation, a view that expands on Confucius' habit idea. In modern philosophy, the debate between law and habit still shows up. The legal realist school says that laws are only useful when people actually follow them in practice. The virtue ethicists say that a good life is built on habits of courage, honesty, and generosity. Both camps can point back to the ancient stories we have heard. The Egyptian scale reminds us that laws need an inner sense of fairness. The Greek. When we sit down with a cup of coffee and think about what makes an action right or wrong, two big ideas often pop up. One comes from a German thinker named Immanuel Kant, and the other from an English lawyer named Jeremy Bentham. Kant talks about duty and rules that we must follow no matter what. Bentham talks about the amount of happiness that an action creates for the people it touches. Both ideas try to give us a guide for how to act, but they do it in very different ways. Kant was born in 1724 in a town called Königsberg, which is now part of Russia. He spent most of his life teaching at the university there. One day in 1784, he gave a lecture that would change the way many people think about morality. In that lecture, he said that we should act only on a rule that we could want everyone else to follow. He called that rule a maxim. He summed it up in a short sentence that still rings clear today. Act only according to that maxim, whereby you can, at the same time, will that it should become a universal law. In plain talk, that means you should only do something if you would be okay with everyone else doing the same thing in the same situation. If you can imagine a world where that rule is everywhere, and it still looks good, then the action passes Kant's test. Bentham was born a little later, in 1748, in London. He grew up watching the poor and the sick in the city's crowded streets. He decided that the best way to judge an action was to look at the amount of pleasure or pain it caused. He wrote a lot of pamphlets about law, prison reform, and economics. In his famous work called An Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation, he gave us a short line that captures his view. It is the greatest happiness of the greatest number that is the measure of right and wrong. Bentham's idea is often called utilitarianism. The word utilitarian comes from the Latin word for use. In simple terms, it means we should choose actions that are most useful for making people happy. Both Kant and Bentham wanted a clear rule for how to act. They just picked different things to count. Kant counted the idea of duty, the inner rule that tells us what we must do. Bentham counted the amount of happiness that spreads out from an action. Let's look at how each of them would handle a common situation. Imagine you are at work and you discover that a co-worker has made a mistake that could cost the company a lot of money. If you tell the boss the truth, the company might lose a big contract and many people could lose their jobs. If you keep quiet, you protect the jobs, but you also hide the truth. Kant would ask, can I will that everyone always tells the truth, even when it hurts? He would say yes, because truth is a rule that can be universal. For Kant, the moral weight of the action comes from following the rule, not from the outcome. So he would tell the boss, even if the result is painful. Bentham would ask a different question. Which choice makes the most people happy overall? He would weigh the pain of the lost contract against the happiness of keeping many jobs safe. If the total happiness from keeping the jobs is greater than the pain of the mistake, Bentham would say the lie is the better choice. He would count the happiness of the workers, the boss, the customers, and even the co-worker who made the mistake. If the balance tips toward more happiness, the lie passes the test. Now let's try a second scenario. You have $100 left after paying your bills. There is a charity that helps feed children in a distant country. If you donate the $100, you could feed many children for a month. If you keep the money, you could buy a nice dinner for yourself and a friend. Kant would look at the rule behind each option. He would ask, can I will that everyone keeps money for personal pleasure when they could help those in need? If the rule that everyone keeps their extra money leads to a world where many go hungry, that rule does not feel right. Kant would argue that we have a duty to help when we can, because the rule of helping those in need can be universal. So he would say, donate. Bentham would add up the happiness from each choice. The children's smiles, the health benefits, the peace of mind for the parents, all add up to a large amount of pleasure. The dinner you enjoy also adds happiness, but on a smaller scale. Bentham would likely say that the donation creates the greatest total happiness, so it is the right move. These two examples show how the two systems can point in the same direction, but they get there by different routes. Kant's route is a rule that never changes. Bentham's route is a calculation that can change depending on the numbers. Of course, each approach has its own problems. One common criticism of Kant's rule-based view is that it can be too rigid. Imagine a situation where a person is being forced to lie under threat of death. The rule, always tell the truth, would say you must lie, even though lying could save a life. Critics say that strict rules sometimes ignore the messy details of real life. They argue that a rule that works in most cases may need an exception in extreme cases. This is the first counter-argument. Rules can be too rigid. The second counter-argument targets utilitarianism. Some people say that counting happiness can miss personal rights. Think of a case where a government decides to imprison a small group of people because it would make the majority feel safer. The total happiness might go up, but the rights of the few are trampled. Critics say that a system that only looks at numbers can allow unfair treatment of minorities. They worry that the greatest good idea can be used to justify oppression. This is the second counter-argument. Counting happiness can miss personal rights. Both Kant and Bentham lived in times of big social change, and their ideas were shaped by real events. Kant gave his famous lecture in Königsberg at a time when the city was a hub of Enlightenment thinking. He was surrounded by scientists, mathematicians, and philosophers who were all trying to find clear, rational ways to understand the world. That atmosphere helped him shape a moral system that was based on reason and universal rules. Bentham, on the other hand, watched the early 19th century factory reforms in England. Factories were booming, but workers, especially children, were often forced to work long hours in dangerous conditions. Bentham's idea that the best laws are those that increase happiness led him to argue for shorter workdays, better safety, and the end of child labour. His writings helped push Parliament toward reforms that reduced the workday from 12 to 10 hours. The link between his happiness, counting, and real-world policy shows how utilitarian ideas can move from theory to law. Let's bring in a couple of analogies that make these ideas easier to picture. Think of Kant's rule as a traffic light. The light says, stop or go, no matter who is driving. The rule does not change because you are in a hurry or because you are late for a meeting. You follow it because it is the same for everyone, and that keeps the road safe. Bentham's calculation is more like a GPS that finds the route with the least traffic and the shortest time. It changes depending on the current conditions. Sometimes the GPS will tell you to take a longer road if it avoids a huge jam, because the overall travel time will be less. Both tools help you get where you need to go, but one follows a fixed rule, the other adjusts to the situation. Historically, we can see Kant's influence in modern discussions about AI ethics. When engineers design an autonomous car, they often ask, what rule should the car always follow? Some propose a rule that the car must never intentionally harm a pedestrian. This echoes Kant's idea of a universal rule that does not bend for convenience. In contrast, utilitarian thinking shows up in public health decisions. During a flu outbreak, officials might decide to close schools to keep the most people healthy, even if it inconveniences families. The decision is based on the total amount of health and comfort saved, which is a utilitarian calculation. Modern philosophers have tried to blend the two approaches. John Stuart Mill, a student of Bentham, added a twist to utilitarianism. He said that some kinds of happiness are higher than others, like intellectual pleasures versus simple bodily pleasures. He also argued that protecting individual rights helps the overall happiness in the long run. This shows a cross-reference where a later thinker tries to fix the rights problem in utilitarianism. Meanwhile, contemporary deontologists like Christine Korsgaard have built on Kant's ideas, saying that our duties arise from the way we see ourselves as rational agents. They argue that even in a world of AI, we still need firm rules about respecting persons. Let's bring in a couple of quotes from the original thinkers to hear their own voices. Kant wrote in his Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals, "Two things fill the mind with ever-increasing wonder and awe, the starry heavens above me and the moral law within me." He meant that the sense of right and wrong inside us is as powerful as the night sky. Bentham, writing in A Fragment on Government, said, "The greatest happiness principle is the foundation of the moral and legislative system." Both statements capture the core of their ideas in a few short lines. Now, how do these ideas play out in everyday life? Think about social media. When you share a post, you can ask yourself, is this something I would want everyone to share? That is a Kantian test. If the post spreads false rumors, you would say no, because you would not want a world where misinformation is normal. On the other hand, you could ask, will sharing this post increase overall happiness? If the post spreads a helpful tip that many people can use, a utilitarian might say it is a good move. The two questions lead you to think about both the rule and the outcome. Another real-world example is the debate over vaccination. A Kantian might argue that we have a duty to respect each person's autonomy, so forcing a vaccine could be wrong if it violates personal choice. Utilitarian would look at the health of the whole community. If vaccinating everyone prevents a disease outbreak and saves many lives, the utilitarian view would support mandatory vaccination. This clash shows why both perspectives are useful. They help us see the tension between respecting individual rights and promoting the common good. When we talk about the greatest good for the most people, we have to remember that the most does not always mean the majority in a simple way. Bentham's original calculations tried to add up each person's pleasure and pain as if they were numbers on a ledger. In practice, we rarely have exact numbers, but we can estimate. For instance, when a city plans a new park, officials might ask, will this park give more people a place to relax than the cost of building it? They are using a utilitarian mindset. Yet they also have to follow zoning rules, safety codes, and environmental regulations. Kantian rules that cannot be ignored. Let's revisit the charity example with a bit more detail. Suppose you have $200 and you can either give $200 to a local food bank that feeds 100 families for a month, or you can donate $200 to a global organization that builds wells in a remote village, giving clean water to 500 people. A Kantian would ask, what rule am I following when I choose one over the other? If the rule is help those closest to me, then the food bank wins. If the rule is help where the need is greatest, then the well project wins. The rule you pick must be one you could will everyone else to follow. Utilitarian would add up the happiness from each option. Clean water might prevent disease and improve health for many more people, so the total happiness could be larger, leading the utilitarian to choose the well project. This shows how the same situation can be judged differently depending on whether you focus on the rule or the outcome. Historical anecdotes can help us see how these ideas grew. In 1785, after Kant's famous lecture, a student named Johann Gottfried Herder wrote a letter praising Kant's idea of a categorical imperative, which is just a fancy name for the universal rule we talked about. Herder said that the idea made him feel like morality was not just a personal feeling, but something that could guide societies. A few decades later, in 1825, Jeremy Bentham visited the prison at Newgate in London. He was shocked by the harsh conditions and wrote a report called Report on Prison Discipline. He argued that prisons should be designed to reduce pain and increase the chance of reform, because that would raise overall happiness. His report helped shape the panopticon design, a prison that aimed to keep inmates under constant observation, supposedly to improve behavior and reduce suffering. Both moments show how the thinkers took abstract ideas and tried to apply them to real problems. Even today, the conversation between rule-based and outcome-based ethics continues in the courtroom. In a famous case in the United States, the Supreme Court had to decide whether a law that bans certain speech could be justified because it protects public safety. The justices who argued from a Kantian angle said that freedom of speech is a rule that must be respected for all, even if some speech is offensive. The justices who used a utilitarian angle said that if the speech leads to riots and harms many, the law might be justified. The decision balanced both sides, showing that modern law often mixes duty and happiness calculations. Let's talk about a modern interpretation that blends the two. Some ethicists talk about rule utilitarianism. They say that instead of counting happiness for each single act, we should adopt rules that, if generally followed, would produce the most happiness. This tries to keep the flexibility of utilitarianism while adding the stability of rules. For example, a rule that says, "Do not lie except to save a life," could be a rule utilitarian guideline. It respects Kant's idea of a universal rule, but also allows for an outcome-based exception. This hybrid approach shows how philosophers keep building on each other's work. Another modern twist is threshold deontology, a term used by some scholars to describe a system where duties hold up to a certain point, after which the need to prevent massive harm can override the rule. Think of it like a safety valve on a pressure cooker. The rule is strong, but if the pressure gets too high, the valve opens to release steam and avoid an explosion. This idea tries to answer the criticism that Kant's rules are too rigid. It says that in extreme cases, we can break the rule to avoid disaster, but only when the disaster is truly severe. When we bring these ideas into personal life, we can see how they help us make choices. Suppose you are planning a surprise birthday party for a friend, but you find out that the friend is feeling sad about a recent loss. A Kantian might say you have a duty to respect the friend's feelings and not force a celebration. A utilitarian would ask whether the party would lift the friend's mood enough to outweigh the potential discomfort. You could decide to keep the party low-key, blending respect for the friend's emotional state with the aim of bringing some happiness. This shows how the two perspectives can guide a balanced decision. In the world of business, companies often face ethical dilemmas. A firm might consider cutting corners on safety to lower costs. A Kantian ethicist would say the company has a duty to keep its workers safe, regardless of profit. The rule, "do not endanger workers," would be universal. A utilitarian would weigh the profit gains against the possible harm to workers and the public's trust. If the harm outweighs the profit, the utilitarian would advise against the shortcut. Many modern corporate codes of conduct try to include both a rule about safety and a goal of overall well-being, showing that both ideas have practical value. Let's revisit the idea of the golden rule, which many people know as treat others as you would like to be treated. Kant's universal law is a more formal version of that rule. He wanted a principle that could be tested in any situation, not just based on personal preferences. Bentham's version of the golden rule is more about outcomes. Do what makes the most people happy. Both are attempts to give us a simple guide that we can apply without needing a law degree. One more historical note. In 1802, Bentham helped draft the Penal Code of. I want to talk with you about a way of thinking about right and wrong that starts with who we are, not just what we do. It is called virtue ethics, and it grew out of the ideas of an ancient Greek named Aristotle. He lived in a time when people were still figuring out how to live together in cities. He asked a simple question: what does it mean to live well? He answered that living well means having a good character. He said that character is built by the habits we form. He called this the good life. Aristotle grew up in a family that ran a medical practice. He saw how a doctor's skill depended on practice and on caring for patients. He also saw how a farmer's success depended on patience and steady work. From these observations, he thought that the best way to become a good person is to practice good actions, just as a musician practices scales. He wrote that moral virtue comes about as a result of habit. In plain words, if you keep doing the right thing, you become a right-doing person. To understand why this matters, let's go back to the start of Western moral thought. Before Aristotle, his teacher Plato talked about a perfect world of ideas. Plato said that we should aim for the idea of the good, a kind of perfect form that we can never fully reach. He thought we could get close to it by using reason. Aristotle liked the idea of a perfect form, but he felt it was too far away for everyday life. He wanted a guide that could help ordinary people make choices day by day. So he turned his attention to the habits we form, the feelings we nurture, and the choices we repeat. Aristotle called the right habits virtues. He split them into two groups. The first group is about our minds. He named these intellectual virtues, like wisdom and understanding. The second group is about our hearts and actions. He called these moral virtues, like courage, generosity, and honesty. He said each virtue sits in the middle of two extremes. Courage, for example, is the middle between cowardice and reckless foolhardiness. Generosity is the middle between stinginess and wasteful splurging. He used the word mean to describe this middle spot, but he meant it as a balance, not as something small or unimportant. One of Aristotle's most famous ideas is the golden mean. He wrote, "Virtue is a state of character concerned with choice, lying in a mean." In everyday language, this means that a good action is not too much and not too little. It is just right for the situation. Think of a thermostat. If the temperature is too low, you feel cold. If it is too high, you feel hot. The thermostat finds the right middle point. Virtue works the same way. It finds the right amount of feeling and action for each moment. Aristotle also believed that the good life is an activity of the soul in accordance with virtue. In simple words, a happy life is one where we are constantly doing what a virtuous person does. It is not a life of occasional good deeds, but a life where good habits shape everything we do. He said that the highest good, which he called eudaimonia, is often translated as happiness, but it really means flourishing. A flourishing life is one where we grow, where we use our talents, and where we feel fulfilled. Let's look at a couple of everyday scenes that show this idea in action. Imagine a student named Maya. She has a small quiz in math class. She could copy a neighbor's answer, or she could write her own. The easy way is to cheat, but Maya decides to be honest. She knows that cheating might give her a better grade this time, but it will not help her learn. By being honest, she builds a habit of truthfulness. Over time, this habit becomes part of her character. When she later faces a bigger test, she will trust her own work. Maya's choice is a tiny step toward the virtue of honesty. It is a habit that adds up. Now think of an older neighbor, Mr. Patel, who often helps the family next door with chores. He shovels snow, fixes a leaky faucet, and watches the kids while the parents run errands. He does these things not because he expects a reward, but because he feels it is the right thing to do. He has turned helpfulness into a regular part of his day. Over the years, his neighbors have come to rely on him, and he feels a sense of purpose. Mr. Patel's habit of helping shows the virtue of generosity. It is not a one-off act. It is a pattern that shapes who he is. These two stories illustrate the core of virtue ethics. The focus is not on a single rule, but on the kind of person we become. The good life, for Aristotle, is a life where virtues guide every choice, big or small. But the story does not end with Aristotle. After his time, many thinkers took his ideas and reshaped them. In the Middle Ages, the Catholic philosopher Thomas Aquinas blended Aristotle's virtue ethics with Christian teachings. Aquinas wrote that virtues help us love God and our neighbors. He kept the idea of habits, but added the idea that divine grace can help us grow. In the early modern period, some philosophers turned away from Aristotle. They preferred to focus on rules, like Kant, or on the results of actions, like Bentham. For a long time, virtue ethics seemed like an old, quiet voice. In the last few decades, however, a new wave of philosophers has revived Aristotle's approach. One of the most influential is Alasdair MacIntyre. He wrote a book called After Virtue, where he argued that modern moral talk has lost its meaning because we no longer share a common story about what makes a life good. He suggested that we need to return to a practice-based view of virtue, similar to what Aristotle said. MacIntyre often points to the way craftsmen used to learn their trade. He says that in a guild, a young apprentice would watch a master, practice the skill, and slowly absorb the values of the craft. The work itself taught patience, precision, and responsibility. This is exactly the kind of moral training Aristotle imagined. Another modern voice is Philippa Foot. She wrote about virtue and moral luck. She argued that virtues are not just abstract rules, but are tied to the kinds of lives we lead. She gave the example of a soldier who acts bravely because his character is brave, not just because the situation forces him. Foot's work help bring back the idea that virtues are rooted in real life, not just theory. Julia Annis is another scholar who focuses on how we can teach virtue. She says that we need to create environments where good habits can grow. She points to schools, families, and communities as places that shape character. Martha Nussbaum, a philosopher who works on emotions and justice, also draws from Aristotle. She talks about capabilities, the things people need to live a full life. She says that a society that supports these capabilities is helping its citizens develop virtues. All of these thinkers agree on a simple point. Virtues are habits that shape who we are. They also agree that we need a community to help us grow. This brings us back to the two anecdotes that show how practice and community shape virtue. The first anecdote comes from Aristotle himself. He liked to spend time in his garden. He would plant vines, prune them, and watch them grow. He used this work as a way to think about character. He wrote that, just as a gardener must tend to each plant, a person must tend to each habit. He said that a gardener who neglects a single vine will see it wither, and the whole garden suffers. In the same way, neglecting a bad habit can spoil the whole character. Aristotle's garden was more than a hobby. It was a living lesson in how small, repeated actions add up to a larger outcome. The second anecdote comes from medieval Europe, when craftsmen formed guilds. A young apprentice would spend years learning a trade like blacksmithing or weaving. The master would not only teach the technical steps, but also the moral standards of the craft. For example, a blacksmith was expected to be honest about the weight of his iron, to be careful so he did not hurt others, and to take pride in the quality of his work. The guild kept records of members who behaved well, and those who cheated were expelled. In this way, the trade itself became a school for virtue. The apprentice learned that skill and morality were linked. This story shows how a community can embed virtue in everyday work. Now, let us turn to some common questions that people raise about virtue ethics. One question is, what happens when virtues clash? Imagine a situation where you must tell the truth, but doing so could hurt a friend's feelings. Honesty is a virtue, but so is kindness. If you tell the truth, you may be honest but unkind. If you hide the truth, you may be kind but dishonest. Aristotle would say that we need to find the right balance for the particular case. He would look at the mean between the extremes of blunt truth and harmful silence. He would ask, what would a wise, mature person do in this situation? The answer may be to speak gently, to choose words that are truthful but also caring. This shows that virtue ethics does not give a simple formula, but it does give a way to think about the tension. It asks us to consider the whole person, the relationship, and the context. A second question is, can anyone become virtuous without instruction? Some people think that virtue is a natural gift. Others think it can be taught. Aristotle believed that we need both. He said that we are born with the capacity to develop virtue, but we need role models and practice. He wrote that we become just by doing just acts. In modern terms, this means that education, family, and community play a big role. However, some modern psychologists argue that certain traits, like empathy, have a biological basis. This suggests that people may have a head start in developing some virtues. Still, the consensus among virtue ethicists is that habit and guidance are essential. Even if a person has a natural tendency toward kindness, without practice that kindness may not become a stable habit. So instruction, whether formal or informal, matters a lot. Let's bring these ideas back to the two everyday examples we talked about. Maya's honesty in a small test may seem minor, but it is a practice that builds trust. If she never faced a situation where cheating seemed easy, she might never learn the habit of honesty. If her teachers and parents praise her for doing the right thing, they are giving her the instruction she needs. Similarly, Mr. Patil's habit of helping neighbors is reinforced by the gratitude he receives and the sense of community he feels. If his neighbors never ask for help, he might not develop the habit. The social environment is part of the instruction. We can also see virtue ethics in modern life beyond these small scenes. Think about a doctor who spends extra time listening to a patient's worries. The doctor's habit of compassion becomes part of his professional identity. Over time, patients trust him more, and his practice thrives. Or consider a teacher who consistently gives thoughtful feedback, even when students make mistakes. The teacher's habit of patience helps students learn better and creates a positive classroom atmosphere. In both cases, the professional role provides a framework for practicing virtues, just as the medieval guild did. Another modern example is the rise of service learning programs in schools. These programs pair students with community projects like cleaning parks or tutoring younger kids. The goal is not just to finish a task, but to develop a habit of caring for the community. The experience is designed to become a habit, not a one-off event. When students return home, they often talk about feeling more responsible and more connected. This shows how a structured environment can help build virtues. Let us look at a modern thinker who connects virtue ethics with the science of habits. Charles Duhigg, in his book about habit formation, writes that habits form a loop. Cue, routine, reward. While Duhigg is not a philosopher, his description matches Aristotle's idea that repeated actions shape character. If we set up cues that lead to virtuous routines, we can reinforce the reward of feeling good about ourselves. For instance, a cue could be a reminder to say thank you after a meal. The routine is the act of thanking, and the reward is the warm feeling of connection. Over time, this loop builds the virtue of gratitude. We can also draw a parallel with the Buddhist concept of right action. Buddhism teaches that ethical conduct is part of a path to enlightenment. Right action includes being honest, not harming, and being generous. This aligns with Aristotle's virtues, even though the cultural background is different. Both traditions see moral life as a practice, not just a set of rules. This cross-cultural link shows that the idea of building character through habit is not limited to one time or place. Now, let's talk about how virtue ethics can guide public policy. Some scholars argue that laws should not only punish bad actions, but also encourage good habits. For example, a city could offer tax breaks for citizens who volunteer a certain number of hours each year. This creates an incentive for people to develop the habit of giving. Another policy could be to require schools to teach character education alongside math and reading. By making virtue a part of the curriculum, we give young people the tools to practice good habits early on. These ideas echo Aristotle's belief that a good society helps its members become virtuous. Critics sometimes say that virtue ethics is too vague to guide us in real dilemmas. They point out that the mean can be hard to spot. They also worry that focusing on character might excuse people who do good things for selfish reasons. For instance, a business person might be generous in public, but only to boost his reputation. Does this count as a virtue? Aristotle would ask whether the generosity comes from a stable desire to help or from a desire for applause. The inner motive matters. Modern virtue ethicists add that we should look at patterns over time, not isolated acts. If a person consistently shows generosity even when no one is watching, we have stronger evidence of a true virtue. Another critique is that virtue ethics seems to rely on a shared view of what the good life looks like. In a diverse world, people may have different ideas of what flourishing means. Some may value independence, others community. Aristotle's view was rooted in the Greek polis, where citizens shared common goals. Today, we must broaden the concept of the good life to include many cultures and lifestyles. Some philosophers, like Martha Nussbaum, propose a list of basic capabilities that all humans need to flourish, such as health, education, and the ability to form relationships. This list can serve as a common ground for discussing virtues across cultures. Let's revisit the two counterpoints we promised earlier. First, the clash of virtues. Imagine a firefighter who must decide whether to rescue a child from a burning building while also protecting his own crew. Courage pushes him to act, but responsibility to his team pulls him back. He must weigh the two virtues and find a balance that respects both. Aristotle would suggest looking at the specific details: how many people are at risk, the likelihood of success, and the overall impact. He would not give a simple rule, but he would encourage a thoughtful case-by-case approach. This shows that virtue ethics can handle complex, real-world dilemmas. When we sit down for a cup of coffee and start talking about right and wrong, the first thing that pops up is the idea that some people think right changes with the people around us, while others say right never changes at all. That clash is what philosophers call moral relativism versus moral objectivity. It sounds fancy, but the core of the debate is simple. Does a good act stay good no matter where you are, or does it depend on the customs of each place? The story of moral relativism goes back a long way. One of the earliest voices was Protagoras, a Greek teacher from the 5th century BCE. He famously said, "Man is the measure of all things." In plain words, he meant that each person decides what is true or right for themselves. If you ask a Protagoras follower, they would say that what a tribe calls honest might look different to another tribe. The idea spread through the ancient world, and later thinkers used it to argue that we should not judge other cultures with our own standards. Fast forward to modern times, and we meet Susan Wolf, an American philosopher who writes about moral luck and the limits of what we can call right. Wolf says that we often think we can point to a single clear rule that tells us what is right, but life is messy. She argues that while some moral truths might be stable, our understanding of them is shaped by the world we live in. Wolf's work helps us see why the debate still matters today. Let's look at two everyday examples that bring the clash to life. First, think about food taboos. In some parts of the world, eating pork is a normal dinner. In other places, pork is forbidden because of religious belief. If you travel from a country where pork is common to one where it is banned, you might feel confused. A moral relativist would say that the right thing to do is to follow the local rule. Don't eat pork where it's forbidden. A moral objectivist would say that the act of eating pork is not a moral issue at all. It's just a personal preference, and no moral rule is being broken. The second example is about global human rights debates. Consider the question of freedom of speech. In some countries, the law says you can say almost anything, even if it hurts others. In other places, the law says you cannot criticize the government or certain groups. A relativist would argue that each country's law reflects its own moral outlook. so we should not call one right and the other wrong. An objectivist would say that there is a universal right to speak freely, and any law that stops that is morally bad, no matter where it is. Both sides have strong arguments. Relativists point out that cultures develop over centuries, and their values are tied to history, language, and daily life. If we try to impose a single moral code, we risk ignoring the deep reasons why people act the way they do. They also note that what we call universal often comes from powerful societies that have spread their ideas far and wide. In this view, moral claims are like recipes that work well in some kitchens, but not in others. Objectivists, on the other hand, argue that some things are simply wrong no matter what. Think of murder, for instance. If a person kills another just because it is part of a ritual, most people would still call that murder. Objectivists say that there are basic standards, like not harming innocent people, that hold everywhere. They also claim that without such standards, we have no way to condemn cruelty, oppression, or injustice when they appear in any culture. Now, let's hear two common counter-arguments that each side faces. The first comes at relativism. Critics say that if we let each culture decide what is right, we can excuse terrible acts. Imagine a society that practices slavery. If we say right depends on culture, then the society could claim its slave system is morally okay. That excuse can make it hard to speak out against abuse. Relativists respond that we can still criticize practices while respecting cultural differences, but the tension remains. The second counter-argument hits objectivity. Critics say that strict universal rules can ignore the details of a situation. Picture a person who steals food to feed a starving child. An objectivist rule that stealing is always wrong would label the act as immoral, even though the context shows a different picture. Objectivists answer that we can have universal principles that allow for exceptions, but the challenge is to keep the principles clear enough to guide us. Historical anecdotes help us see how the debate has shaped real events. During the Enlightenment, philosophers like John Locke and Immanuel Kant argued for natural rights that apply to all humans. At the same time, many European nations owned slaves in the colonies. The clash between the idea of universal human rights and the practice of slavery sparked fierce debates. Abolitionists used the language of objectivity. All men are created equal, to argue that slavery was morally wrong everywhere. Those who defended slavery often appealed to local customs and economic needs, a relativist line of thought. A later story comes from the 20th century civil rights movement in the United States. Martin Luther King Jr. quoted the Declaration of Independence, saying that all men are created equal, and used that universal claim to demand an end to segregation. At the same time, many southern states claimed that their way of life, separate schools, separate churches, was part of their cultural heritage. The clash between a universal moral claim and a cultural defense is a classic example of the relativism versus objectivity debate in action. Let's bring in a few more voices to deepen the picture. The German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche warned that there are no facts, only interpretations. He was not saying that anything goes, but that our moral language is shaped by power and perspective. Nietzsche's view pushes us to question whether any moral claim is truly neutral. On the other side, the British philosopher Mary Warnock argued that we can find common ground by looking at the consequences of actions for human well-being. She believed that a shared sense of flourishing could serve as a universal guide. When we try to apply these ideas to everyday life, analogies can help. Think of moral rules like a map. A relativist map changes its shape depending on the terrain you are walking on. If you move to a new country, the map redraws itself to match the hills and rivers there. An objectivist map stays the same no matter where you go. It shows the same roads and landmarks, even if the scenery looks different. Both maps can get you to a destination, but they work in different ways. Another analogy is a set of kitchen tools. A relativist kitchen has a different set of knives, spoons, and pots for each type of cuisine. A chef who moves from Italy to Japan must learn new tools to cook the local dishes. An objectivist kitchen keeps the same tools everywhere, believing that a good chef can make any meal with the same set. The debate is whether we need special tools for each culture, or whether a single set can handle everything. Let's hear a couple of direct quotes that capture each side. Protagoras, as we mentioned, said, "Man is the measure of all things." That line is a clear call for relativism. In contrast, Immanuel Kant wrote, "Act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law." Kant's view is a classic expression of moral objectivity. If you can imagine everyone doing the same thing, then it is right. Susan Wolf adds a modern twist. She says, "We are often tempted to think that moral truth is out there, waiting for us to discover it. But our moral judgments are also shaped by the stories we tell about ourselves." Wolf's words remind us that even objectivists cannot ignore the role of personal and cultural narratives. Now, let's walk through a practical scenario that blends the two everyday cases we mentioned. Imagine you are a traveler in a country where a certain food is considered sacred and never to be eaten. You are invited to a dinner, and the host serves a dish that includes that food. If you refuse, you might offend the host. If you eat it, you might feel you have broken a personal belief. A relativist would say the polite thing is to follow the host's custom, perhaps by politely declining and offering an alternative. An objectivist might say that you have a right to your own dietary choices, and the host should respect that, no matter the local tradition. The tension shows how both sides try to balance respect for culture with personal moral standards. Consider the global human rights debate about freedom of speech. In some nations, the government blocks social media to stop what it calls harmful rumors. A relativist might argue that the government is protecting its citizens and that it's a moral choice rooted in local values. An objectivist would point to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which says everyone has the right to express ideas without fear. The objectivist would claim that any restriction is a moral violation, even if it aims to protect people. The clash appears in news headlines, court cases, and protests worldwide. When we think about the counter-argument that relativism can excuse bad acts, we can look at the history of the Holocaust. The Nazi regime claimed that its actions were justified by a twisted view of German culture and destiny. If we accepted a purely relativist stance, we might have been forced to treat those claims as merely cultural differences, losing the moral ground to call them evil. The lesson many philosophers draw is that we need a way to say that some actions are truly wrong, no matter the cultural story behind them. On the flip side, the counter-argument that objectivity can ignore context shows up in the debate over capital punishment. Some countries have a universal rule that murder deserves death. An objectivist might say that this rule applies everywhere. Yet, imagine a case where a person killed in self-defense after being threatened with a weapon. A strict universal rule would still call for death, ignoring the life-saving context. Critics of objectivity say that we need to look at each story before deciding what is right. Let's bring back the Enlightenment example. When the French philosopher Voltaire wrote, "I do not agree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it," he was championing a universal right to free expression. At the same time, many European powers kept colonies that forced local people to adopt foreign laws and religions. The clash between the universal claim and the local reality forced people to think hard about whether moral rules could truly be the same everywhere. The civil rights movement gives us another vivid picture. In the 1960s, activists marched through the streets of Selma, Alabama, chanting, "We shall overcome." Their protest was based on a universal idea that all people deserve equal treatment. Yet, many Southern lawmakers argued that segregation was part of their state's tradition, and that changing it would upset the social order. The tension between a universal moral claim and a cultural defense created a national debate that still echoes today. Now, let's look at a modern philosopher who tries to bridge the gap. Thomas Nagel writes about moral luck, the idea that sometimes the outcomes of our actions depend on factors beyond our control. He says that we should keep a universal sense of right and wrong, but also recognize that luck can affect how we judge those actions. Nagel's view offers a middle path. We can hold people to a standard, yet understand why context matters. Another contemporary voice is Kwame Anthony Appiah, who talks about cosmopolitanism. He suggests that we belong to many overlapping communities: our family, our nation, our planet. He says that we can respect cultural differences while also holding on to shared human values. Appiah's idea helps us see that moral objectivity does not have to erase cultural diversity. It can provide a common language for dialogue. To make these ideas stick, let's picture a simple everyday scene. You are at a school cafeteria, and a student refuses to sit with a classmate because of that classmate's religion. A relativist might say that the student is following a cultural norm from their home community that discourages mixing. An objectivist would say that the student's action violates a universal rule about treating others with respect. The school can use this clash to decide whether to enforce a policy that protects inclusion for all, or to allow families to decide for themselves. Now think of a workplace scenario. A company operates in several countries. In one country, it is common to give gifts to government officials to speed up paperwork. In another country, that practice is illegal and seen as bribery. The company must decide whether to follow local customs or stick to a universal anti-bribery policy. If it chooses the local custom, it may be accused of corruption. If it chooses the universal rule, it may lose business opportunities. This real-world example shows how the debate is not just academic. It affects daily decisions for many people. Let's turn to a more personal story. Imagine a teenager who wants to wear a traditional dress that includes a head covering, but their school has a rule that no hats or headgear are allowed inside. The student's family says the head covering is a moral and religious duty. A relativist might argue that the school should bend its rule to respect the student's cultural practice. An objectivist might argue that the rule is a neutral policy that applies to everyone, and that exceptions could lead to unfair treatment. The school's decision will reflect which side of the debate it leans toward. When we think about the big picture, we can see that both sides have valuable insights. Relativism reminds us to listen, to understand that people's moral views grow out of their lives and histories. Objectivity reminds us that some harms are so serious that we need a shared language to call them out. The challenge is to find a balance that lets us respect differences while still standing up for basic human dignity. One way philosophers try to strike that balance is by using the concept of pluralism. Pluralism says that there can be many legitimate moral perspectives, but they must all respect a core set of rights, like not killing innocent people. Pluralists borrow from both relativism and objectivity. They say we can have different customs, but we should agree on a few basic rules that protect everyone. Another approach is called reflective equilibrium. This idea, championed by John Rawls, suggests that we should adjust our moral principles and our judgments about specific cases until they fit together nicely. In other words, we keep moving back and forth between general rules and particular situations until we feel the whole system makes sense. This method tries to keep the best of both worlds. It respects context while still aiming for stable principles. Let's revisit the Protagoras quote, "Man is the measure of all things." If we take it too far, we might end up saying that anything goes. But if we temper it with a Kantian idea that we should act as if our actions could become a universal law, we get a more balanced view. That balance is what many modern thinkers aim for. Susan Wolf's words about stories also help. She says that we shape our moral views by the stories we tell about who we are. If we tell a story that says we are all part of one human family, we are more likely to accept universal rights. If we tell a story that says our tribe is special and must stay apart, we lean toward relativism. The stories we share shape the moral climate. Now, let's talk about a concrete legal case that shows the clash. In the United States, the Supreme Court case of Roper v. Missouri, 2005, decided that it is unconstitutional to sentence minors to death. The court used a universal principle that children are less culpable because of their developing brains. Some countries still have the death penalty for minors, arguing that their cultural and legal traditions allow it. The case shows how a universal moral claim can clash with local practices, and how courts sometimes become the arena where the debate plays out. Another legal example is the International Criminal Court's work on genocide. The ICC prosecutes people for crimes that the world has agreed are so terrible that no culture can justify them. When the court tried former leaders from Rwanda, it relied on the idea that genocide is a universal crime. Yet, some leaders in other countries argue that their actions were part of a cultural or historical struggle, trying to use relativist defenses. The court's decisions illustrate how objectivity can be used to hold people accountable across borders. Let's bring in an analogy from sports. Think of a soccer match where each team follows the same rules. No handball, offside, and so on. Those rules are universal for the game, no matter which country the teams come from. If a team tried to change a rule just because their local tradition says it's okay to use hands, the game would become chaotic. That's how objectivity works. When we sit down with a cup of coffee and talk about what is right and wrong, the conversation often drifts toward the newest things that our world throws at us. In the last few decades, we have seen a flood of new tools and new problems. Gene editing lets us change the code of life. Artificial intelligence can drive a car without a human hand on the wheel. Climate change makes the whole planet feel like a house that is slowly heating up. All of these raise fresh moral questions. How do we decide what to do when the old rules feel too thin? The story of modern moral thinking starts with a few big ideas that grew out of older traditions. The 20th century saw two main camps. One camp, led by people like John Stuart Mill, said that the right thing is the one that brings the most happiness to the most people. This view is called utilitarianism. The other camp, led by Immanuel Kant, said that we must treat each person as an end in themselves, never just as a means. This view is called deontology. Both camps tried to give us a way to judge new actions, but they used very different tools. In the 1970s, a new kind of moral challenge appeared. Scientists in England helped a couple have a baby using a technique called in vitro fertilization, or IVF. The baby, Louise Brown, was born in 1978. The news sparked a heated debate. Some people said that creating life in a lab was playing God. Others said that if a technology can help people have children, it should be welcomed. The debate forced philosophers to think about how we treat embryos, how we value potential life, and what rights a lab-created child should have. It also showed that new science can push moral thinking into new territory very quickly. Peter Singer, a contemporary ethicist, took the utilitarian view and applied it to many modern issues. He wrote, "If we can prevent something bad without sacrificing something of comparable moral importance, we ought to do it." Singer's words are simple, but they carry a heavy load. They ask us to look at the costs and benefits of every action, even when the action involves new technology. Singer has used this idea to argue for animal rights, for helping the poor, and for careful use of genetic tools. His style is plain, and his point is clear. We have a moral duty to reduce suffering whenever we can. Another voice that matters today is that of environmental ethicist Aldo Leopold. He wrote, "A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community." Leopold's words remind us that moral thinking is not only about people. It is also about the whole web of life. When we talk about climate change, Leopold's idea helps us see that the planet itself is a moral patient. The health of forests, oceans, and soils matters for our own well-being, and it matters for the rightness of our choices. Let's look at a concrete case that many of us will face soon: the self-driving car. Imagine a car that can drive itself on a busy street. One day, the car's sensors detect that a child has run into the road. The car has two possible actions. It can swerve left and hit a group of pedestrians, or it can stay straight and hit the child. The car's computer has to choose which crash path to take. This is a classic moral puzzle called the trolley problem. But now it is a real engineering problem. The question is not just what a philosopher would say, but how we program machines to act. One argument, echoing Singer's utilitarian view, says the car should choose the action that saves the most lives. If swerving would cause 2 deaths and staying would cause 1, the car should swerve. The other argument, drawing from deontological thinking, says that the car should not treat any person as a mere means to save others. That view might say the car should not actively choose to hit the child, even if it means more people die. Some engineers try to blend both ideas, creating a rule that the car should avoid causing harm whenever possible, but also try to minimize total damage. This blend shows how modern moral thinking tries to balance different traditions. Now think about a different everyday choice: buying a cheap shirt from a fast fashion brand, or spending a little more on a sustainably made shirt. The cheap shirt may cost a few dollars, but it often comes from factories that pollute rivers and pay low wages. The sustainable shirt costs more, but it uses organic cotton, fair wages, and less water. The moral question is whether we should pick the cheap option that hurts the planet and workers, or the pricier one that helps them. This choice is a small version of a larger climate debate. If each person makes the sustainable choice, the collective impact could be huge. But if most people stick with cheap goods, the damage continues. The progress versus precaution debate captures this tension. On one side, progress supporters argue that new technologies bring benefits that outweigh the risks. They point to gene editing that can cure inherited diseases, or AI that can reduce traffic accidents. On the other side, precaution advocates warn that we do not fully understand the long-term effects. They ask us to pause, test, and set limits before we unleash powerful tools. Both sides have good points. The progress camp often cites Singer's line about preventing bad outcomes, while the precaution camp may quote the ancient warning, "Better safe than sorry," and remind us of the unintended consequences that history has shown. A second counterpoint is individual choice versus collective duty. Some philosophers argue that each person has the right to decide what to buy, what to eat, how to live. This view respects personal freedom. Others say that because climate change is a shared problem, we all have a duty to act in ways that protect the common good, even if it means giving up some personal comforts. This clash shows up in the fast fashion example. Choosing a sustainable shirt may feel like a personal sacrifice, but it also contributes to a collective effort to reduce waste and pollution. Historical anecdotes help us see how these debates have played out before. In the 1990s, world leaders gathered at the Kyoto Protocol talks. The meeting was a turning point. It was the first time many countries agreed to set limits on greenhouse gas emissions. The talks sparked a wave of global climate discussions that continue today. Some people remember the Kyoto meeting as a hopeful moment when the world said, "We will try to fix this together." Others recall that the agreement fell short of what scientists said was needed, and they point to it as a cautionary tale about half-hearted collective action. Another story comes from the early days of genetic engineering. In 1975, scientists created the first recombinant DNA molecules. The technology promised new medicines, but also raised fears about designer babies and unknown ecological effects. The U.S. National Institutes of Health set up a committee to oversee the work. The committee's report warned, "We must proceed with caution, but we must also not let fear stop progress." This balance of caution and progress mirrors the modern debates over CRISPR gene editing, where we can now cut and paste genes with high precision. The same questions about safety, fairness, and responsibility reappear. When we talk about modern moral challenges, we also need to mention the role of technology in shaping our values. The philosopher Nick Bostrom warns about superintelligent AI, machines that could become smarter than humans. He asks, what if an AI decides that human values are obstacles to its goals? Bostrom's worry pushes us to think about how we design AI to respect human dignity. The question is not just technical, it is deeply moral. We need to embed ethical principles into the code, much like we embed safety features into a car. At the same time, some thinkers argue that technology can help us become better moral agents. The ethicist Shannon Valor writes about moral wisdom in the age of digital tools. She suggests that we can use AI to highlight the consequences of our actions, helping us make more informed choices. For example, an app could show the carbon footprint of a clothing item while we shop. This kind of feedback could nudge people toward the sustainable option without forcing them. It shows how technology can be used to support moral growth, not just create new dilemmas. Real-world applications of these ideas are already happening. In some countries, doctors must get special approval before using CRISPR on embryos. The rules try to balance the hope of curing genetic diseases with the fear of unintended harms. In the automotive world, companies are testing ethical governors that tell self-driving cars how to act in emergency situations. These governors are built on moral theories and on public input. The fact that engineers are asking philosophers for help shows that moral thinking is no longer an abstract exercise. It is part of design work. Modern interpretations of old ideas also help us see new angles. The principle of equal consideration of interests, a phrase Singer uses, can be extended to non-human life. When we think about AI, some argue that if an AI ever develops feelings, we would have to give its interests the same weight. This is a speculative extension, but it shows how a simple principle can stretch to new domains. Similarly, Rawls' idea of justice as fairness can be applied to climate policy. Rawls says that a fair system is one that would be chosen behind a veil of ignorance, where we do not know our own position. If we imagine not knowing whether we will live in a rich or a poor country, we might pick stronger climate measures to protect the most vulnerable. Analogies can make these ideas clearer. Think of a garden. If you plant a few weeds, they may look harmless at first. But over time they spread and choke the flowers. The garden is like our planet. Small choices, like buying cheap clothes, are like planting weeds. They may seem tiny, but together they can hurt the whole system. On the other hand, planting a tree is like choosing a sustainable product. It takes effort, but it adds shade and oxygen for everyone. The garden analogy helps us see why collective duty matters. Another analogy is a river that powers a mill. If the river runs fast, the mill works well. If we dam the river too much, the flow stops and the mill grinds to a halt. Technology is like a dam. It can give us power. But if we build too many dams without thinking about the river's health, we lose the water that sustains life downstream. This picture fits the climate story. We have built factories, cars, and power plants that push the climate toward dangerous levels. If we do not adjust the flow, the whole system suffers. Quotes from primary sources keep the conversation grounded. In his 1975 book, Animal Liberation, Singer writes, "The question is not whether we can, but whether we should." That line captures the essence of the progress versus precaution debate. In the 1992 Rio Earth Summit, the Declaration of Rio says, "All peoples have the right to a healthy and productive life in harmony with nature." This statement ties the collective duty idea to a global agreement. In a 2002 interview, Bostrom says, "We must be very careful about the choices we make now, because they will shape the future of humanity." These words remind us that our decisions today echo far into the future. When we bring these pieces together, a picture emerges. Moral thinking is not a single rule book. It is a conversation that moves across time, across fields, and across peoples. The early debates over IVF showed how new biology forces us to ask what counts as a human life. The Kyoto talk showed how nations can try to act together, even if the effort is imperfect. The self-driving car dilemma shows how machines bring old moral puzzles into new hardware. The fast fashion choice shows how everyday habits add up to big environmental effects. Cross-referencing ideas helps us see patterns. The precaution principle that appears in environmental law also shows up in bioethics. Both say we should not move forward when we lack enough knowledge about risks. The equal consideration principle from utilitarianism appears in animal rights and in discussions about AI rights. The veil of ignorance from political philosophy shows up in climate justice, because it asks us to imagine we could be anyone on the planet. These links show that the same moral tools can be used in many places. What can we take away from this long chat? First, we should recognize that new tools do not erase old moral questions. They just give them new shapes. Second, we should listen to both sides of the counterpoints. Progress can bring great benefits, but we need to be careful not to rush into harms we cannot undo. Precaution can keep us safe, but if we wait too long, we may miss chances to help. Third, we should see that individual choices matter, but they are part of a larger web. Choosing a sustainable shirt is a small act, but it also signals demand for better practices. Choosing to support strong climate policies is a collective duty that can shape market forces. Finally, we can remember the words of the ancient philosopher Aristotle, who said, "We are what we repeatedly do." The habits we build today, whether in labs, in factories, or in our own homes, become the character of our society. If we practice careful, compassionate, and responsible habits, we can steer technology toward the good. If we ignore the moral side, we risk creating tools that hurt more than they help. So as we sip our coffee, let's think about the next time we see a self-driving car on the road, or the next time we shop for a shirt. Let's ask ourselves, what would happen if we choose the safe path? What would happen if we choose the bold path? What does my choice do for my neighbors, for the planet, for the future? These simple questions keep the moral conversation alive. They help us turn big, scary ideas into everyday actions we can understand and own. In the end, the meeting point of bioethics, technology, and the environment is a place where philosophy meets life. It is where we test old ideas against new realities. It is where we can learn from past debates, like the IVF controversy, and from global meetings, like the 1992 Climate Summit. It is where we can hear voices like Singer's, Bostrom's, and Leopold's, and let their words guide us. And it is where each of us, over a cup of coffee, can decide how to act in a world that keeps changing faster than ever before. The challenge is big, but the tools are simple. Listen, think, and choose with care. Imagine you are sitting at a kitchen table with a cup of coffee. You hear a friend ask, "Why do we care about right and wrong?" The answer is not hidden in a dusty book. It lives in the small choices we make each day. When you text a friend, when you pick up a piece of litter, when you vote, you are using the same ideas that philosophers have been talking about for thousands of years. In this part of the video, we will walk through those big ideas, see how they show up in everyday life, and hear a few stories that make the point clear. The story of moral thinking starts a long time ago. In ancient Greece, a man named Socrates would ask people simple questions about what is good. He believed that if you could name the good, you could act on it. He never wrote a book, but his student Plato recorded the conversations. In one dialogue, Plato writes Socrates saying, "The unexamined life is not worth living." That line is a reminder that we need to think about why we do what we do. In ancient China, Confucius taught that good behavior comes from caring for others and keeping promises. He said, "Do not do to others what you do not want done to yourself." That is a very early form of the golden rule that appears in many cultures. Later, Aristotle tried to sort out what a good life looks like. He said the best life is one where we practice virtues, like honesty and courage, over and over until they become part of us. He called this habitual excellence. Aristotle also warned that a single act does not make a person good or bad. It is the pattern of actions that matters. That idea helps us see why a single cheat on a test can be a warning sign, not just a one-off slip. Fast forward to the Enlightenment. Immanuel Kant wrote that we should act only on rules that we could see everyone follow. He called this the categorical imperative. He wrote, "Act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. In plain words, before you do something, ask if it would be okay if everyone did the same thing. If the answer is no, then the act is likely wrong." Kant also believed that each person has value in themselves, not just as a tool for others. That view supports the idea that we should treat people with respect, even when it is inconvenient. A few decades later, John Stuart Mill argued for the greatest happiness principle. He said that actions are right if they bring the most happiness to the most people. He wrote, "Actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness." This view looks at the results of an action, not just the rule behind it. It helps us think about the impact of choices like buying cheap goods that may be made in harsh conditions. All these thinkers give us tools. They give us rules, they give us habits, they give us a way to look at results. But they also leave questions. How do we know what will make us happy? How do we know what rule to follow when the rules clash? Modern moral psychologists have tried to answer those questions with experiments and stories. One of the most popular modern guides comes from Jonathan Haidt. He says that our moral judgments start with quick feelings, then we find reasons to back them up. He calls this moral intuition. Haidt's book, The Righteous Mind, gives a simple guide. First, notice your gut feeling, then ask what story you are telling yourself about it. Another useful guide is Dan Ariely's Predictably Irrational. Ariely shows how we often make choices that go against our own long-term interests because we focus on short-term gain. He gives a clear tip. Pause, write down the future consequences, then decide. These guides help us see why everyday decisions can feel hard. Let's look at a couple of scenes that bring the ideas to life. Scene 1. A teenager named Maya sits in a quiet library. She has a big test coming up, and she has not studied enough. Her friend whispers, "I have a copy of the answers. You could use it and get an A." Maya feels a quick rush of excitement. That feeling is the moral intuition Haidt talks about. She also hears a voice that says, "If everyone cheats, the test won't mean anything." That voice is the Kantian rule. She thinks about the future, remembering Ariely's tip about short-term gain versus long-term trust. If she cheats, she might get an A now, but the teacher might find out later, and her reputation could be damaged. She also worries that she will start to trust herself less. She decides to ask the teacher for extra help instead. She chooses the honest path, building trust that will help her later in college applications. Scene 2. A shopper named Luis walks into a grocery aisle. He sees 2 jars of coffee. One is cheap, labeled Blend A. The other is a little more expensive, labeled Fair Trade Blend B. The price difference is small, but Luis feels a tug. The cheap jar promises a good deal, a short-term gain. The fair trade jar promises that farmers will be paid fairly, a long-term benefit for a community. Luis thinks of the short-term gain versus long-term trust argument. He also thinks of personal freedom versus social pressure. He wonders if he is choosing because he truly wants to support fair trade, or because his friends keep talking about it on social media. He pauses, recalls a quote from Mahatma Gandhi: "The best way to find yourself is to lose yourself in the service of others." He decides to buy the fair trade coffee. He feels a small lift in his chest, like he is doing something good for people he will never meet. Both scenes show how the old ideas of virtue, rule, and consequence mix with modern research on how we actually think. They also show that everyday choices are tiny tests of our moral compass. Now let's hear a short story that many people know, the Aring of the King test. In this story, a king asks his subjects to bring him a ring that can prove they are honest. The first subject brings a plain gold band and says, "I have no claim to it, but I bring it because it is honest." The second subject brings a glittering gem-set ring and says, "I stole it, but I will give it to you to show I can be trusted now." The king smiles and says, "The first person has shown honesty without a price. The second has shown that a lie can be covered with a gift, but the truth is still missing." This story illustrates the difference between a habit of honesty and a single act that looks good on the surface. It reminds us that moral value is in the pattern, not the sparkle. A more recent story went viral on social media. The video shows a woman finding a wallet on a city bench. Inside is a small amount of cash and a photo of a child's drawing. She looks around, sees no one, then walks to the nearest police station and hands the wallet over. The video caption reads, "Honesty is still alive." In the comments, many people talk about how easy it would have been to keep the cash, but the woman chose to do the right thing because she imagined how the owner would feel. This modern tale echoes the ancient golden rule and shows that even in a fast-moving world, the choice to act honestly still matters. Both stories give us a picture of what moral decision-making looks like in practice. They also give us a way to talk about the two counter-arguments we promised earlier. The first counter-argument is short-term gain versus long-term trust. Many people think, if I cheat now, I get an A. That helps me get into a good school. That is good for my future. But the long-term trust part says that if others learn you cheat, they will not trust you later. Trust is like a bank account. Every honest act adds a deposit. Every lie makes a withdrawal. If the account goes negative, it is hard to borrow again. This idea appears in the work of psychologist James Fowler, who studied how trust builds in groups. He found that people who act honestly even when no one is watching tend to have stronger friendships and better teamwork later on. The second counter-argument is personal freedom versus social pressure. Some say, I should be free to choose what I buy, even if it hurts workers far away. Others say, if we all feel pressure to buy fair trade, the market will shift and help those workers. Social pressure can be a force that nudges us toward better choices, but it can also feel like a loss of freedom. The philosopher John Stuart Mill warned that too much pressure can limit personal growth. He wrote, "Over himself, over his own body and mind, the individual is sovereign." At the same time, Mill also believed that society can set rules that protect people from harm. The balance between freedom and pressure is a constant dance in moral life. Let's look at a few more real-world examples that show how the big ideas fit into daily life. Example 1. Texting a friend about a sensitive topic. Imagine you receive a message from a friend who is upset about a breakup. You want to reply quickly, but you also want to be kind. The Kantian rule would ask, would it be okay if everyone replied with harsh words in this situation? The answer is no. The virtue approach would say, what would a caring person do? The result approach would ask, will my words help my friend heal, or will they add more pain? By checking each angle, you can send a short, supportive note that says, "I'm sorry you were hurting. I'm here if you want to talk." This small act builds trust and shows empathy, a trait that psychologist Paul Bloom says is a skill we can practice. Example 2. Picking up litter in a park. You see a soda can on the grass. You could walk past it, thinking it is not your problem. The short-term gain is you keep walking without stopping. The long-term trust argument says that if everyone leaves litter, the park will become dirty and no one will want to use it. The virtue view says that a good person keeps the environment clean. The result view says that a clean park makes everyone feel better. You bend down, pick up the can, and toss it in the bin. That tiny act adds up. Over time, many small actions keep the park nice for the whole community. Example 3. Voting in an election. When you go to the polling place, you might think, "My vote does not matter." That thought is a short-term feeling of powerlessness. The long-term trust argument says that if many people think this way, the system loses legitimacy. The virtue approach says that a responsible citizen participates. The result approach says that policies affect many lives, so your vote can shape outcomes. By voting, you join a larger pattern of civic responsibility that keeps democracy healthy. Now, let's bring in a couple of historical anecdotes that illustrate how moral ideas have moved societies. The first anecdote comes from the ancient city of Athens. In 504 BC, a lawmaker named Solon introduced reforms that reduced the power of the rich and gave more rights to the poor. He did this because he believed that a city could only stay strong if its citizens felt they were treated fairly. He said, "Justice is the foundation of a good city." Solon's reforms showed how a ruler can use the idea of fairness to change the whole community. It also shows that moral ideas can become laws that affect daily life. The second anecdote is from the 19th century United Kingdom. A woman named Florence Nightingale noticed that soldiers in a war hospital were dying from infection. She argued that the hospital should be kept clean, even though the army thought that was unnecessary. She used the principle that do no harm to push for better sanitation. Her work saved thousands of lives and changed how hospitals are run today. This story links the idea of caring for others with concrete action that improves health for many. Both anecdotes show that moral thinking can move from a personal belief to a public change. They also remind us that ordinary people can make a big difference when they follow the ideas we are talking about. Let's turn to some modern interpretations that bring the old ideas into the digital age. One modern thinker, Susan Hack, talks about epistemic responsibility. She says that we have a duty to check facts before we share them, because false information can harm others. In everyday life, this means looking before you forward a meme or a news story. The rule-based view would say, only share what you can verify. The virtue view would say, a responsible person checks the truth. The result view would say, sharing false news can cause panic, so it is better to be careful. This idea fits with the practical guide from moral psychologist Robert Cialdini, who writes about the principle of social proof. He says that people often follow what others do, so if we model careful sharing, others will follow. Another modern idea is ethical design in technology. Designers of apps think about how to make choices easier for users. For example, a rideshare app might show the carbon footprint of each ride, nudging people to pick a greener option. This reflects the long-term trust argument. If users see that the company cares about the environment, they will trust the brand more. It also reflects the personal freedom versus social pressure balance. The app does not force a choice, but it gently pushes toward a better one. Now, let's revisit the two short stories and pull out the lessons they give us. In the Ring of the King story, the plain gold band represents honesty that costs nothing. The gem-set ring represents a flashy act that hides a lie. The king's decision shows that true moral value is not about how impressive an action looks, but about the inner motive. This ties back to Aristotle's habit idea. We become good by doing good again and again, not by one big show. In the viral video about the lost wallet, the woman's choice shows how empathy works in practice. She could have kept the cash, but she imagined the owner's worry. That imagination is what psychologist Daniel Goleman calls emotional intelligence. He says that being able to feel another's pain helps us act kindly. The video also shows the short-term gain versus long-term trust argument. The cash was a quick gain, but returning the wallet builds a reputation for honesty that will help her in the future. Both stories give us a clear picture. Moral decisions are about more than just the immediate result. They are about the pattern we set, the feelings we nurture, and the impact on the community. Let us now hear a few quotes from primary sources that capture the spirit of these ideas. Socrates, as recorded by Plato, said, "Know thyself." That simple line invites us to look inside before we act. Confucius wrote, "The man who moves a mountain begins by carrying away small stones." That reminds us that everyday acts, like picking up litter, add up. Kant wrote, "Act only according to that maxim whereby you can, at the same time, will that it should become a universal law." Mill wrote, "The only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community, against his will, is to prevent harm to others." Edmund Burke said, "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing." Each of these lines points to a different angle: self-knowledge, habit, rule, outcome, and inaction. Putting all these pieces together, we can see a simple roadmap for everyday moral decision-making. First, notice the feeling that pops up. When we sit down to think about how a community can grow a shared moral habit, it feels a bit like planting a garden together. Each person brings a seed, a bit of soil, and a hope that something good will grow. The idea is not new. Long ago, philosophers asked how groups can agree on what is right and how to keep that agreement alive. One of the most influential voices in that conversation was John Rawls. He wrote a book called A Theory of Justice that still shapes how we think about fairness in a group. Rawls said that a fair society is built on two main ideas. First, everyone should have the same basic rights, like the right to speak and the right to be safe. Second, any differences in wealth or power should help the least well-off members of society. He put those ideas in a simple line: justice is the first virtue of social institutions. That line is easy to remember, and it gives us a clear goal for any community that wants to be fair. Rawls did not come up with his ideas in a vacuum. He was reacting to older ideas about how societies work. He looked at the social contract tradition, which started with thinkers like Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Those writers imagined a kind of agreement that people make when they form a society. Hobbes thought people needed a strong ruler to keep them from fighting. Locke believed that people have natural rights that the ruler must protect. Rousseau said that people are naturally good but can be corrupted by society. Rawls took those ideas and added a new twist. He asked us to imagine a original position where we do not know anything about ourselves, our age, gender, wealth, or talents. In that imagined situation, we would choose rules that are fair to everyone because we could end up as anyone in the real world. That thought experiment is a way to keep our own biases in check when we think about rules for a community. The idea of a vival of ignorance that Rawls used is a powerful tool for building shared morals. It reminds us to step back from our own interests and ask what would be fair if we could be anyone. In a small neighborhood, that might look like asking, if I were the child who never gets a ride to school, would I still support the rule that everyone must drive on the same street at the same time? If the answer is no, then the rule needs to change. That simple question can guide a community toward habits that feel just to most people. Modern civic projects often use Rawls' ideas without naming them. Take the example of a neighborhood garden. A group of families decides to turn an empty lot into a place where anyone can grow vegetables. The garden has a set of shared rules. Each family gets a plot, but the size of the plot can vary depending on how many people live in the house. The garden also has a common basket where any extra produce is placed for anyone who needs it. The rule about the common basket is a direct nod to Rawls' second principle, where the benefits of a system should help the least well off. In practice, the garden teaches children to share, to wait for their turn, and to see the value of helping a neighbor who might not have a garden of their own. The garden becomes a small model of a fair society, where the rules are made to protect the most vulnerable and to give everyone a chance to thrive. Another everyday example is a school program that rewards kindness. In a middle school, teachers notice that students often compete for grades and sports trophies, but they rarely get recognized for helping a friend or standing up for someone who is being bullied. The school decides to create a kindness points system. Every time a student does something caring, like sharing a snack, helping a classmate with homework, or speaking up when they see unfair treatment, they earn points. Those points can be turned in for small privileges, like extra recess time or a chance to choose a class activity. The program is built on the idea that moral habits are not just abstract ideas, but actions that can be measured and encouraged. It also reflects Rawls' idea that a fair system should benefit those who might otherwise be left out. In this case, the students who are shy or who don't excel in sports get a way to be seen and valued. The school's approach shows how a community can create a habit of caring that feels real to the kids. These two examples illustrate a bottom-up approach. The garden and the kindness program start with people's everyday actions. They grow from small choices, and the rules are shaped by what works in the local setting. This method has a lot of strengths. It feels natural, it lets people see the results quickly, and it can adapt to the specific needs of the group. But there are also two important counterpoints that we need to keep in mind. First, top-down rules can feel forced. Imagine a city council that decides to ban all cars from a downtown area to reduce pollution. The rule is made with the best intentions, but many people feel it is imposed without listening to their daily struggles. A delivery driver might lose income, an older adult might find it hard to get groceries, and a small business might see fewer customers. When rules come from above without a chance for the community to shape them, they can create resentment. People may follow the rule out of fear of a fine, not because they believe it is fair. That kind of compliance is fragile. If the enforcement stops, the behavior often falls back to the old ways. The garden example shows how a rule that feels like it came from the community, like the common basket, gets more genuine support than a rule that feels imposed. Second, bottom-up habits can miss fairness. When people create habits on their own, they might overlook the needs of those who are not part of the immediate group. In the garden, if the families only share extra produce with each other and never think about the nearby homeless shelter, the garden's good intentions stop at the fence. In a school, a kindness program that only rewards visible acts may miss quieter forms of support, like a student who quietly listens to a friend in crisis. Those unnoticed actions can be just as important, but they don't get the points. If the system only looks at what is easy to see, it can leave out people who need help the most. That is where a top-down perspective can help fill the gaps. A citywide policy that requires every garden to donate a portion of its harvest to a food bank, for example, can make sure the benefits reach beyond the immediate participants. Both sides have value. The best moral landscape often comes from mixing the two. Rawls himself hinted at that mix when he wrote that the principles of justice should be chosen in an original position, but that they also need to be applied in real life through institutions that can adapt. He said that the basic structure of society, its laws, its economy, its education system, must be set up to protect fairness, but that everyday habits and community projects are the ways those structures become alive. History gives us clear stories of how this mix works. After World War I, many German towns were left in ruins. The Allied powers could have simply imposed a new set of rules from the top, but they chose to involve local citizens in rebuilding. In the town of Marburg, residents were invited to help design new housing blocks, schools, and public squares. They were given a voice in deciding how the new streets would be laid out, where playgrounds would go, and how public services would be shared. The result was not a perfect city, but it was a place where people felt ownership over the new rules. The rebuilding process also included a top-down element. The Allies required that certain democratic institutions be set up, that freedom of speech be protected, and that the new legal system reject the old totalitarian codes. The combination of local participation and higher-level guarantees helped create a shared moral landscape that valued both individual input and universal rights. The story of Marburg shows how a community can grow common habits of cooperation while still being guided by a broader sense of fairness. A more recent story comes from the global youth climate strikes that started in 2018. Young people around the world began walking out of school on Fridays to demand action on climate change. The movement started as a bottom-up wave of personal stories. A teenager in Sweden talking about the loss of a glacier, a student in Kenya describing drought that threatened crops, a high schooler in the United States worrying about wildfires. Those stories turned into a global chorus that forced governments and corporations to listen. The strikes themselves are an example of a bottom-up habit. People gathering, chanting, and holding signs. But the movement also sparked top-down responses. Some cities created new policies to limit car emissions, some schools added climate education to their curricula, and some countries pledged to cut carbon emissions by a set date. The youth strikes illustrate how personal moral habits, walking out of class for the planet, can push larger institutions to adopt fairer rules that protect the future. The movement also shows the counterpoint that when the top-down rules are too weak or feel like a token gesture, the youth can become frustrated and call for deeper change. To understand why these stories matter, it helps to think about an analogy. Imagine a river that runs through a town. The river is the flow of moral habits. If the banks are high and strong, the water stays where it should and helps the fields grow. If the banks are low, the water can flood and cause damage. The banks are like the rules and institutions that guide the flow. They need to be built high enough to protect the most vulnerable, but they also need to be flexible so that the water can move and nourish new areas. Rawls' ideas are like the blueprint for building those banks. The garden and the school program are like small streams that feed the river. The top-down policies are like the levees that keep the river from spilling over into places that would be harmed. Both the streams and the levees must work together for the river to be healthy. Cross-referencing other thinkers can deepen our view of this mix. The Chinese philosopher Confucius said that a good ruler should govern by virtue and not by force. That echoes the idea that top-down rules work best when they are rooted in shared moral habits, not just imposed. The Indian leader Mahatma Gandhi taught that the best way to find yourself is to lose yourself in the service of others. Gandhi's emphasis on personal action aligns with the bottom-up approach, where each person's habit builds the larger moral picture. Both thinkers remind us that moral habits are not just about laws or personal choices alone. They need each other. Modern scholars have taken Rawls' ideas and applied them to new problems. One such thinker is Martha Nussbaum, who expands the idea of fairness to include what she calls capabilities. She argues that a just society should give people the chance to develop basic abilities like health, education, and emotional well-being. In a community garden, that might mean ensuring that families with limited mobility still have a way to participate, perhaps by assigning a helper or by providing raised beds. In a school kindness program, it could mean recognizing that some students express kindness through quiet listening rather than loud gestures, and giving them points for that. Nussbaum's work shows how the raw idea of fairness can be turned into concrete actions that respect the diversity of people's lives. Another contemporary voice is Amartya Sen, an economist who talks about social choice. He says that when a group makes a decision, the process matters as much as the outcome. If people feel left out of the decision-making, they may not follow the decision, even if it is good for them. This idea supports the garden's practice of having a monthly meeting where everyone can suggest changes to the planting schedule. It also supports the school's practice of letting students vote on what kind of kindness projects to run each month. By giving people a voice, the community builds trust, and trust makes the moral habits stick. Let's bring these ideas back to the everyday. Imagine you live in a small town that wants to start a community care day once a month. The idea is simple. On that day, neighbors help each other with chores, share meals, and talk about what they need. To start, a few families volunteer to set up a potluck. They invite everyone, and soon the day becomes a chance for people to learn about each other's lives. Some families bring fresh bread from their garden, others bring tools to fix a broken fence. Over time, the town decides to formalize the day. They create a short set of guidelines. No one should feel forced to join, and the day should include at least one activity that helps the most vulnerable families. The guidelines are written after a meeting where every resident can suggest a rule. This process mixes bottom-up habits, people sharing food and help, with a top-down framework that protects fairness. The result is a habit that feels natural, but also has a safety net. Now consider a city that wants to reduce litter on the streets. One approach is to put more trash cans and write signs that say, "Keep our city clean." That is a top-down rule. It can work, but many people feel they are just being told what to do. An alternative is to start a street clean crew where volunteers meet each Saturday to pick up trash together. The crew shares stories about why a clean street matters to them. Maybe a child's safety, maybe pride in the neighborhood. Over time, the crew's habit spreads and more people join. The city notices the improvement and decides to support the crew with a small grant for gloves and bags. The grant is a top-down help that respects the existing habit. This blend shows how a community can grow a shared moral habit that feels both personal and supported by the larger system. When we think about building a shared moral landscape, it helps to keep two questions in mind. First, who benefits from the rule or habit? Second, who might be left out? These questions are the heart of Rawls' fairness test. If a rule passes both questions, it is likely to become a habit that people keep. If it fails, the habit may crumble when the next challenge comes. The garden example answers the first question by showing how the common basket helps the family that has a bad harvest. It answers the second question by reminding us that the garden must also think about the nearby shelter. The school kindness program answers the first question by giving all students a way to be recognized. It answers the second by reminding teachers to look for quiet acts of care. The post-war rebuilding of German towns answered both questions by giving locals a voice while also ensuring that the new laws protected basic rights. The youth climate strikes answered both by showing how personal action can push governments to adopt policies that protect the planet for future generations. Quotes from the thinkers we mentioned can anchor these ideas. Rawls wrote, "The principles of justice are chosen behind a veil of ignorance." That line reminds us to imagine we could be anyone in the community. Confucius said, "When the ruler loves the people love the ruler." It tells us that rules feel right when they come from caring. Gandhi's words, "You must be the change you wish to see in the world," push us to act in small ways that add up. Nussbaum reminds us, "Justice is the respect for the dignity of each person." Sen adds, "Freedom is the capacity to shape one's own life." Each of these quotes can be a small seed that grows into a habit. Let's look at a final analogy that ties everything together. Think of a quilt made of many squares. Each square is a habit, a rule, a story, a small act of sharing. Some squares are bright and bold, like a public policy that bans single-use plastic. Some squares are soft and quiet, like a neighbor helping an elderly person carry groceries. The stitches that hold the quilt together are the shared values: fairness, respect, care. If the stitches are weak, the quilt falls apart. If the squares are all the same, the quilt looks dull and may not fit the needs of everyone. A good moral landscape is a quilt where each square reflects the unique needs of a part of the community. And the stitches are strong because they were made with both top-down guidance and bottom-up care. In practice, communities can start by asking a few simple questions at a town hall or a school meeting. What do we want to share? What do we need to protect? Who might be left out? Then they can set a tiny rule that addresses a clear need. For the garden, it might be every week we will put at least 5 pounds of extra produce into the common basket. For the school, it might be each student will write a short note of thanks to a classmate once a month. After a few weeks, the community checks in. Does the rule work? Does it feel fair? If not, they adjust.